Hello, everybody. I'm John Nowels. I'm the Undersheriff in Spokane County. I'm filling in today for Sheriff Knezovich, who's out of town. And today on Spokane Talks and the Badge Report, we're going to talk a little bit about the procedures and the new laws that are in place for officer-involved shootings or officer-involved incidents where potential lethal force has been used. I brought with me today Lieutenant Khris Thompson with the Sheriff's Office, who is currently our resident expert in officer-involved shooting incidents and the officer-involved shooting protocol. He's a member of the SIR team, and that's SIRR, as a Spokane Incident Regional Response. And I probably got that wrong, didn't I, Lieutenant?
Yes.
So what does SIR stand for?
It's actually SIIRT, and it's the Spokane Independent Investigative Response Team, which just changed in the last year or so based upon some of the legislative changes we had to take care of.
So my information was a little dated. I apologize. So what we're talking about specifically is anytime a law enforcement agency in the state of Washington uses force against someone, and that force could potentially be fatal or potentially be cause injury significant enough to be either life-altering, life-changing, or of course fatal. And in the legislation 2 years ago, there were a lot of new restrictions placed on law enforcement agencies. Prior to the legislation in 2020 and some subsequent legislation in 2021, we had a SIR team, SIRR, which was comprised of many local agencies to include the Spokane Police Department, the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, Washington State Patrol, and many of the surrounding agencies in eastern Washington. And we would investigate incidents that occurred. And any agency in the SIR protocol that had signed on to it participated in that investigation. Lieutenant Thompson, why don't you talk to us a little bit about what changed in 2020 and in 2021 as far as how those investigations occur? And I will say we'll start with the fact that it is generally law enforcement is responding to some type of call for service or has initiated contact with a citizen, and then at some point force is used. Will you talk to us a little bit about what kind of actions trigger a response from the CERT team?
Certainly. And we can go back even a little bit further than that. You know, we've as an agency and multi-agencies in the region, have had a SEER team in place since before 2008. We recognized long ago that transparency and bringing our agencies together to complete a unbiased, evidence-based investigation was a necessity, and we wanted to be able to give our citizens that information as well. This was the best way to do it. The changes in legislation under Initiative I-940 that was, passed into law back in late 2018, with the language being adopted through substitute House bills to basically line out which was WAC 139-12010, which is the governing WAC for how we now conduct investigations in an independent nature. Beginning back to the initial question you were just going over, is it could be a number of different reasons that the SEER team is called into action under a protocol. But generally they're based upon an intentional use of deadly force by an officer. It could be an officer-involved shooting. It could be a use of force that turns up while unintentional use of deadly force that leads to an encounter where someone passes or is gravely injured.
Okay. So to be clear for our viewers, it does not necessarily have to involve a shooting. It could be somebody is trying to use some sort of a control technique or some sort of physical force, and any use of physical force that led to a severe or potentially fatal injury. But the key is it is potentially deadly use of force.
That's correct. Even taking it a bit further, they've made it an intentional use of deadly force or an intentional use of force that would likely result in the loss of life or a severe injury. That's what the WAC is now outlined.
Okay. So I think what would be beneficial to our viewers is to understand what occurs when one of those use of forces happen. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens when you are the venue agency, where your agency is the employer of the officer who used the force, and you are the agency who where that occurred at. We call that the venue agency. Many times, and I can tell you from our experience, for our viewers, is a lot of times the incident occurs, a supervisor shows up on scene, understands that the criteria for the protocol have been met, and then a notification goes out to the chain of command inside the department, and usually the notification is made to radio that we're activating the SEER protocol, and that usually triggers phone calls to the member agencies where they start bringing resources in to conduct the investigation. Lieutenant, you are generally the person who gets called for the Spokane County Sheriff's Office when this occurs. Why don't you walk us through what some of the legislation mandates you to do as the liaison for the venue agency?
Well, it actually starts all with patrol. There's some very specific tasks that are put upon our patrol personnel prior to the SEER team ever responding. And if you go and read the WAC, it outlines it pretty well for you. But the basics of it is safety of the scene and personnel, life-saving, obviously is paramount, immediate life-saving once the scene's safe, preservation of evanescent evidence, and identification of potential witnesses. Those are all things that happen prior to the SEER team ever being contacted. It's a very quick and evolving scene, but once those things have been established, we've made the scene safe, they make the notification for a protocol activation to the SEER team, which is sent through radio. They start reaching out and contacting the SEER commanders. There's 3 SEER commanders overall for the SEER. As you said, we have member agencies as well, but they don't have SEER commanders over the 3 larger bodies. So we tend to be the first call for service.
Can I interrupt you real quick? And I think it's something that you pointed out that I want to reiterate for the viewers is generally when we're the venue agency, it occurs in our jurisdiction. And we do have some responsibilities at the initial outset of this where there are some things that we are required to do. However, the WAC then specifies that once we secure the scene, once we preserve the evidence that can be transient or transitory, our responsibilities change and our actual ability to do any investigation changes at that point, right? We can no longer, as the venue agency, be involved in the investigation.
That's correct. The WAC has made it so that once the SEER team takes over the entire scene investigation, the venue agency is no longer involved in the investigation in any form or facet.
Okay. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail in a second about that, but talk about from your perspective what happens. What is your role if you're the venue agency? What do you as the liaison do at that point?
It all depends on where you are and what time of day or night that the activation occurs at. I'm listed as the #1 contact in our policy and in the policy for Shrex to give us a call, and that's the Spokane radio. They'll give me a phone call. I have some basic information I need to obtain, incident numbers, condition of the suspect and officers, location, command point. There's a number of duties that fall along with that to get the basic outline. Me as the SEER commander then start making notifications to other SEER personnel to get investigative resources in motion to respond to the scene. I'll also notify and have conversation with other SEER commanders to include the liaison or lead agencies to respond to the scene itself. Once the assembled team has responded to the scene, it's incumbent upon them to make sure they have all their resources that they need to take over the scene and investigation in its entirety based upon the WAC. Once they say that they have it, our agency would step out totally outside of the investigation, shy of having some resources that no one else has. And if we have that and they ask for it, we'll obviously give them those resources. But we also have to be able to tell our community citizen members why we use those resources, why SPD or the state or one of our member agencies didn't have that, and why they requested it of us. So once they take that over, I would serve as the liaison at that point to facilitate any requests that they may have of us for resources, management of personnel that we have on the exterior, because we still have to provide a safe perimeter for our investigators to work, but nowhere they could be in the midst of the actual investigation.
Okay. And I think that's important for the public to understand. You articulated a couple things in your description that show where our limitations are as the venue agency. And from my perspective, I will tell you, a lot of times my role, Sheriff Knezevich's role, other members of command, we want to give the public as much information as possible about what occurred to alleviate any questions about what occurred in the incident, to alleviate any accusations or a lack about a lack of transparency. But I think it's important for the public to understand when you see an elected official or a chief or an assistant chief standing in front of a camera when they are the venue agency, that a lot of times they have extremely limited information at that point in the investigation. And you'll hear them use words like initial information or apparently this is what occurred. And there's a lot of discussion at those scenes because remember, we're limited in what we are told now by the WAC. The investigating agency cannot provide us with a briefing anymore. So the only information the venue agency has, and the leader of that venue agency has, is just exactly what they can get from a public safety statement or from witness officers who are at the scene. And a lot of times, that information is very, very limited. And you'll see that our statements at times are very brief because of that, because we don't want to provide any information that is not verifiably accurate. And I know you are in those discussions with leadership quite frequently, and it happens at every single one of these scenes. But I also want to now talk about, once you're the liaison for the venue agency, and once the SEER team has arrived and they've come up with a game plan and they have the information they need, you as the liaison, there is not much for you to do. You're not given any information. You are there to just be contacted if they need any other information that the venue agency might have, or if there's any other resources. But you're also generally the sheriff's office representative when the SEER team goes out to do an investigation and we're not the venue agency. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the process that occurs when we show up on scene, and talk to us about what the lead agency is, how we break up the work, and how that goes, and contact with community members and things that are required by the WAC.
Most definitely. As you hit on it, we are a multi-agency response. So when you have your initial response as a SEER team protocol activation response, you'll have your venue agency that have done the stuff that we just described previously, reference preservation of evidence, scene safe, all those topics. But you get there, your initial is just gather all your personnel together. You're going to start to evaluate what your scene is, because it could be one scene, it could be multi-scenes, it could be a number of different things, so you have to start breaking those things down. You'll get in touch with the liaison or command staff from the involved agency and request a witness officer. You're looking for the officer at that particular time that might have the most information so you can begin your investigation. You'll get a briefing from that officer. If they don't have a witness officer, it's just the involved officer, you'll get the information from a public safety statement. And you have to base your investigation off that. With those, we start breaking our scenes down. You'll determine who the lead agency is going to be overall.
And what kind of criterion determines that generally?
Most of the time, it has to do with the available resources that agency has that particular time, and how involved the scene is and what the specifics of it are. If we happen to have more resources available than our partnering agency, we might take that role on. Or if there had been an incident previously where it had been the other agencies and they had taken that lead role on, we try and make sure that there's some equity in there in how we do our work.
Because they're very resource intensive.
That's an understatement. It takes everything we have. It takes the entire investigative division of the crimes against persons, and quite frequently resources outside of our my unit as well. We'll pull in our property and drug units to help with these investigations because they are so manpower intensive.
And the units of the other agencies like the Washington State Patrol and Airway Heights and things like that. They take those investigators as well, all of them.
Yes, it depletes what you have for quite a period of time. We also have to be prepared if something else were to come out in the midst of an OIS or a protocol activation, that we have to be able to have resources still be able to respond to those as well. Yeah. As we know in law enforcement, we don't get to pick the time or location of other incidents occurring, so we have to be prepared to take those on as well. Okay. So you'll break it down. By the lead agency, you'll be selected. Once you have the information and you have your resources in hand, you'll let radio know and the other team members that you have the scene, meaning that the venue or involved agency is no longer to be part of the investigation at all, which means I have to have resources to man every position of the investigation. Inner perimeter, our crime scene log, our lead investigators, and they all have to be certified to be a lead investigator for certain aspects of our investigation.
And what does that mean?
It's criteria set forth through CJTC as mandated by WAC 139-12. They have to have certain educational courses behind them. They have to have the experience and time in the unit to be qualified. We actually have to go through an application process through CJTC to get a lead investigator certificate.
Okay.
Now, there's aspects of the investigation that don't have to have a certified lead investigator for, but they're not the scene lead, they're not the overall lead, they're not certain roles in there. There'll be roles of canvas, assist roles as well. So once we break all those down, we start assigning our positionals based upon what we see as our duties based upon the scene. You're going to have your overall lead. You're going to have a scene lead, which is the person or persons, because there's usually a lead and assist in there, that start looking over the actual scene of what took place and making determinations on what search warrants have to be written, what resources need to be gathered to collect the evidence. These things could include our forensics unit, could include the state CSRT team, traffic units. We bring those in as well to help with mapping and 3D digital photography to stitch into our scenes to give the investigation the most accurate depiction of what we're doing and what took place. We have personnel that will interview witness officers. We have people that do officer inventory, that go in there and they inventory all the items that were on the police officers at the time of the incident. Once again, for transparency, it helps us with our investigation as well to let us know what we have to be looking for. And it goes all the way down to the minute of details. Once that's occurred, we'll have a command post where Senior Command will meet. We'll outline the plan and the assignments on a large board to keep track of them, because it is a moving target for us as we move through things, as we discover further stuff, while our investigators are out doing their job. And this maintains that capacity and function until such time as we're done with the scene and we're ready to release it.
Yeah. No, at some point, there are some requirements for the WAC that we involve citizens in the investigation. Will you talk to us a little bit about some of the requirements, some of the documentation, some of the declarations that go along with this type of an investigation?
Certainly. As part of the WAC, it also requires that we have citizen community members as be part of our investigations. You'll have different groups, they refer to themselves as something other than SEER, obviously, but it's basically an IIT, an independent investigative team. And we're required by the WAC to have 2 citizen communities members that have been selected by the venue agency to participate in these. Generally, our agencies will have more than 2 personnel selected. There's usually at least 5, because you have to have make it count that they may not be available all the time. But as part of that, we make notification to them as soon as possible that an incident has occurred, give them the details of it, ask them if they'll be willing and able to participate as a member of the SEER team. Once they make the agreement, we set a citizen community member meeting or briefing within a couple of days. It gives them time to make sure they can make their schedule and the investigative schedule meets up. Upon that, they'll be provided the initial press release that was put out by the involved agency. They'll be provided with the conflict of interest forms, which all our investigator and investigative resources sign off, basically saying that they don't have a conflict with conducting this investigation.
And that conflict might be they have a prior relationship with either the person that the force was used against or the officer involved, or really there's no relationship or conflict of interest with anybody involved with the incident that they're investigating. Is that correct?
That's exact.
Okay.
So we'll let them review those as well, and those all have to be, dated and signed off on with a statement that they don't have conflict. And if they do have conflict, we find out what that conflict truly is before we let them go forward on an investigation. It could be that they just happen to know the person through work. If they determine that's not going to be a conflict and we don't see it be a conflict, we'd make notation and we'd pass that information along as well to citizen community members as we're conducting our briefing. Another part is that they have to sign a confidentiality agreement, meaning that they can't start talking about the investigation or details they know about the investigation that other people wouldn't be privy to. It keeps the sanctity of the investigation intact. As part of that, after that briefing, they're given the opportunity to ask questions, and we'll answer the questions based upon what we've found out so far through an investigation. It also requires that they're provided with any more SEER releases, because any more media releases after the initial will come from the SEER team, shy of the involved agency making a decision to name the officers involved. Everything up until the conclusion comes through the SEER team that will go to the press. They're provided those prior to them going to the press for their review as well.
Right. And generally, the venue agency releases the names of the involved officers in conjunction with a SEER team media release, generally. That doesn't mean that it has to be done in that fashion, but that is generally the way we have all agreed to handle that. So you've walked us through what happens in these investigations, and there are subsequent meetings of the SEER team after the investigation, the investigation of the scene closes, and those investigations can sometimes go on for months as physical evidence is processed, analyzed, and interviews are done with the involved officers, generally done through, counsel. So one of the things that was established was it in I-940, I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is the establishment of the OII, the Office of Independent Investigation. That is an office that was established by the governor, or is underneath the supervision of the governor, where their intent is that they will have completely independent investigators come in and investigate these types of encounters. So far, they have named the director of the OII, but have not been able to establish teams as of yet. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your understanding is of the current state of affairs with the Office of Independent Investigations?
Certainly. There's been many discussions over about the activation of this particular office. They were supposed to be stood up, I believe, the 1st of July of this year. However, it took them a little bit longer to find and appoint their director. And with that, he had to go and basically establish a new agency from the ground up. While they may have had minor funding, they didn't have the stuff that they needed in place to do these. They had some minor infrastructure and were working on policies and procedures, but they had no personnel actually assigned to that office until he was selected. I believe that was mid-June of this year. So the likelihood that they were able to meet that timeline of a July 1st, standing the office up and being able to go out and do what the legislation has directed to them was not going to happen.
Well, and if I understand correctly, and I want you to speak to this if you can, there's some criteria set in place about who can actually be an investigator in the Office of Independent Investigation, and some of it's a little surprising. And I'll talk to what my opinion is about that. But can you tell us what those requirements are right now?
I can't give the exact timelines. I believe that anybody that's going to be assigned as an investigator to the team for the OII would have to have had a period of length of time if their previous law enforcement to total separation, with the ultimate goal to being no law enforcement background. right now they don't have the personnel that can do those investigations because they're very complicated, and it takes some experience to do those. You definitely want to check if you're going to be that investigating body that you have the experience backing your investigation. Otherwise, it can't be transparent and it can't be thought of as a whole investigation.
Yeah. Well, and I will tell you my opinion of this is, we have experienced homicide investigators, and they have to go through and prove to the Criminal Justice Training Commission, CJTC, that they have met certain standards of training and experience before they can be a lead investigator. Yet, with this state agency that is going to be ultimately in charge of conducting these investigations, they want people ultimately that have no law enforcement background, which means no investigative experience investigating homicides or those types of cases. I personally find that curious. It makes me and other law enforcement personnel very, very concerned about what the quality of these investigations would be. Certainly makes it seem political. I personally equate this action as saying, well, if this was happening in the medical profession, it would be the equivalent of saying the medical board would go, when they have a complaint about somebody's action, they would have a medical board convened to make a decision about what should happen, but no one on that board could be a doctor or have ever been a doctor. And then they would get to make a decision about whether this doctor had done something that was correct or unprofessional or was bad action. And it just doesn't seem reasonable. And that's a concern I have. And I know I'm not alone in that concern. And it would be great if we could get our legislature to moderate a little bit on that, because bad investigations can lead to bad legal outcomes for officers. And I think that's something that's causing quite a bit of anxiety with our deputies and officers on the streets these days. There's concern that they will justifiably use force. They are put in a situation where they're forced to make a split-second decision. No officer comes to work on any given day wanting to take someone's life or to permanently alter someone else's life, including theirs. And there's some concern about an investigation that's going to be done in that by people who are unqualified to do it. Now, I'm not asking you to make a comment on that. That gets to be my purview, and something that I can tell the viewers that needs to change. So I think we've given our viewers quite a bit of information. Is there anything else you think we need to add that would be helpful for the public to understand about how this process goes?
The hard part about that is this process is very intricate. It's very laid out. It takes a lot of manpower to get there. And we just touched on the very basics of what go into an IIT or SEER protocol investigation. What I would hope is that our public, they start to see a lot of things in the social media start popping up. We start to see in the negative. I would suggest, just like they tell us in law enforcement, is wait. See what the investigation says. Be ready for the outcome when it comes out. Stop maybe jumping to conclusion or speculation that causes nothing but problems for them and for other people. So I would say wait and have trust in your investigators, because we are going to provide you a transparent, unbiased, evidence-based investigation.
And I think the general public has to be aware that does not come immediately. You are not going to know all the details, and frankly, the pertinent details in the first 10 minutes. You're not going to know it maybe sometimes in the first 10 days or 10 weeks. It might take quite a bit of time to find all of the information necessary to provide a case to the prosecuting attorney to make a decision on whether the action was justified or not justified. And we do see quite a bit of online keyboard warrior kind of activities at the front end of these, because people jump to conclusions and make assumptions. And I will say, from a command staff point of view, the information we have is so limited, and by statute we are told we cannot receive information. People need to understand that we would love to provide more information and be more transparent, but the WAC doesn't allow us to. In my opinion, the WAC did the opposite of what it was intended to do, which is provide more transparency and independent investigation, and it has hamstrung law enforcement leadership from being able to provide that transparency. So I'd like to thank everybody who's listened. I think we provided some good information on a very intricate topic. And thank you for watching the Badge Report. Again, I'm John Nowels, the Undersheriff here, filling in for Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich and Lieutenant Khris Thompson from the Spokane County Sheriff's Office with us today. Thank you, Khris.
Thank you.
This is Dave Reynolds with Source Real Estate. Our secret is our 1% listing fee. All the services, marketing, photography, and more for a 1% listing fee, saving you thousands. May the source be with you. 999-8878 and visit sourcerealestate.com.